Video of somebody measuring ultraviolet, extreme ultraviolet, harmful ultraviolet radiation that normally doesn't get through. I don't know how you could not have it hurt you. If you're young, the ultraviolet goes through your skin. You will not get sunburn. It's the B and the A that sunburn you. Ultraviolet C creates injury that occur in deeper tissue, mainly the fascia, the connective tissue that connects soft tissue to other soft tissue. Most of the time, it's a fibrous tissue. It's found all over your abdomen. It's what holds all your body organs together like a giant sack. But in between tissue, in between the fibers in your muscles, there's connective tissue. In your joints, there's connective tissue that's fibrous. And we're not talking just ligaments or tendons. This is just the fiber mesh, the fibrous matrix in soft tissue. When you're young, the connection between the fibrous tissue and the one that has red blood circulating through it is that younger people repair much quicker than older people. So if you receive ultraviolet C in a constant chronic fashion, it's somewhere where there's fascia, it's going to eventually separate from the healthy tissue. And then you have a tear that starts to progress. And the instruments show that ultraviolet C is getting through. A lot of people are measuring it. They're instruments. And I want to say this. When you have two people who are searching for the truth and we're gathering evidence, we're all looking at stuff together, sharing ideas and postulating what could be causing all of this stuff, what's going on. When there's a disagreement in something that's subjective, what do the people do? What do they say? They say, well, what do the instruments say? Let's see what the data is. One of the things that bothers me about science, especially on YouTube, is the way that photographs are proof. And photographs aren't proof of anything unless you can sustain throughout time and sustain, especially if you're talking about brightness or dimness, you would have to sustain and compare many different photos. But one thing is you would want to compare them at the same months of the year, depending on where your position is in the focusing cone. But it's perplexing how people lose physics when they see photographs. You still have to pertain to the physics of light. And photographs are evidence. Make no mistake about it, photographs are evidence. But remember when Oprah's head showed up on Anne Margaret's body? Like, oh, look at the new Oprah. Okay? So photographs don't prove anything. They really don't, especially if you pull them down over the internet, and especially if they're from NASA. So if you're using NASA photographs as proof of anything, you have to have a sustained, constant, comparable stream of photographs. And you have to have a database that you can go back and compare past to present. But photograph of anything is almost never proof until you provide a foundation of support for the photograph itself. When you're talking about light, there's so many different ways to control light on anybody's photograph, from the one that is actually taken to the one that gets beamed down to the one that makes it to the to a YouTube video. Whatever dimness or brightness you're using in a photograph as evidence of anything does not prove and cannot prove and will never prove much of anything when it comes to observing changes in the sun. One of the main things that affect the brightness of the sun in any photograph is the aperture, and is the color filtering, is the zoom, is the nature of the camera, is the nature of the lens, is the nature of the angle of the sun, is the nature of the clouds, and the nature of just about another half dozen other things that could change the brightness of a photograph. So let's say there was a photograph of ground deformation at Yellowstone. And Mary Greeley, who tracks Yellowstone quite closely, by the way, she has a photograph that shows uplift, and somebody else has a photograph that doesn't. And both are searching for the truth, and they're like, well, my photograph says, that tree's kind of tilting, and this one looks like the tree isn't tilting, so there must not be uplift over here. And so from a single photograph, well, first thing you want to do is go, well, let's compare photographs. Let's go back 2 years, 3 years, and see if we can find a photograph from the same angle, from the exact same angle, from the exact same camera, from the exact same aperture. I mean, that would be very hard to do, wouldn't it? So when you use a camera or a photograph to prove anything about the sun, you got to know it's never proof, ever. Unless you meet a bunch of strict criteria. In a court of law, if you have a picture of, let's say, Mary Greeley holding a machine gun in a bank, does that mean it was really her? And if you try to put Mary in jail with your photograph in a court of law, the judge is going to say, well, did you take that picture? No, never mind. There goes the photograph. It's that quick. Trust me. But if you did take the picture and you say it demonstrates something, what angle, what day, what time, and if you're comparing it to anything else, what day, what time, what aperture, what camera, they're going to want to know all of that to verify that your photograph is real. And that's in the old days. Now with the days of Photoshop, anything's possible, as you have seen already on YouTube. So, but what's disturbing is when people use photographs of the sun and try to say that the visible light is dimmer on the sun by using a photograph of the sun that's not even a visible light. Of 304 angstroms. Most of the photographs you see of NASA, from NASA, from SDO, SOHO, almost none of those are in visible light. To see something in visible light, you would have to use something like Mauna Loa Observatory, white light. White light's visible light. If there's more white light in the sun, whichever all of you are seeing, if it feels like more energy coming off of the sun, if you are feeling, and there's an instrument that says what you're seeing and what you're feeling is absolutely correct, and then somebody comes along and says, well, I got a photograph. See, it's dimmer. Ignore the instruments. That would be completely wrong. That would be like Mary Greeley forgetting about the seismographs, forgetting about the GPS ground deformation, and forgetting about the uplift data and just using a photograph to tell you what's going on in Yellowstone. Not hardly ever going to happen. And there's a lot of things, people do admit the sun's different now. I mean, you just can't deny the obvious too long before you lose credibility. So that's why we've had the rolling disclosures for the last 3, 4, 5 years. So without knowing what angle, whether you're 3 degrees above, 3 degrees below on your satellite, the ecliptic, without knowing the aperture setting, how do you measure visible light? Isn't that kind of like taking a picture of ground deformation? How is that any different? I mean, there's differences. Of course, you can nitpick that one to death. But I mean, really, a photograph versus an instrument. And so most people searching for the truth, when they can't find the truth, what does the gauge say? It feels hot out here, but to me, it feels cold. I have a fever. Do you have a fever? Well, we'll take our own temps. Now let's take the outside temps. Well, you run to the instruments. Do you smell smoke? I don't know. Let's look at the gauges on your car. What do? You run to the instruments when you can't formulate a firm conclusion about something. You run to the instruments. And there's many hypotheses on why the sun has changed, and in doing so, in creating these hypotheses, what happens is that you actually admit to what we've been trying to prove all along. And we're trying to get people to admit to the irradiance. We're trying to get people to put up graphs, even if it's only for a second, and they spend the 90% of the video talking about something else, at least the term irradiance is being used. Another thing that's confusing about irradiance is who's using the term, because sometimes a person at CERN may have a different definition of what gamma radiation is than a person using a satellite measuring tool, or a person radiation therapy on a tumor. You'll see too, when you look at what's an X-ray, what's gamma, you'll see that you'll have charts, and then that some are identical and some are not. You'll see there's gray areas between when you stop becoming an X-ray and you start becoming gamma. As far as astronomers are concerned, 0.1 nanometers, which is a very tiny wavelength, 1/10 of a nanometer, to 7 nanometers is what's known as the soft X-ray background. Just Google soft X-ray backgrounds. People say, well, the reason the sun's white now, the reason the sun's white, and we've already proven to you why the sun's white, but people still say, well, the reason the sun's white, it really doesn't matter why the sun's white. We know it's different. You feel it. You see it. And if it were due to the corona of the sun being brighter and putting off more radiation, then you would expect the terrestrial climate on Earth to change, and you would expect that we would do everything in our desperate power to prevent what would be coming. You would see tidal pools cook and everything die in the tidal pools, wouldn't you? And that's what we've seen. You would see forest fires and raging and destroying communities in non-fire seasons. And that's what we've seen. Then a trigger of methane because of the heating, and that's what we're seeing. You would see a lot of changes. You would see paint peeling off of signs. That's what we're seeing. You would see more and more health effects. You would see dehydration and heat-related injuries in people that you wouldn't think would have heat-related injuries. That's been happening. Animals succumbing. You would see crop failures, and that's what we're seeing. You would see algae blooms, and that's what we're seeing. But the bottom line is that when you have an instrument that measures the sun that's above the filter, the white filter that you say is creating the sun's white, that's above the solar simulators that people say is floating around, the lens array floating around the sky, the satellites that measure this irradiance is not just one satellite. A lot of the data, though, does come in through the University of Colorado. They're the ones who make a lot of those fun and fancy simulations you see all over the internet. SORCE, S-O-R-C-E, is a collection of satellites, all running around geosynchronous orbit, unless somebody knows something I don't know, like the Earth is flat. but the ultraviolet C is hurting people. We knew it was going to hurt people. We didn't know exactly what radiation was going to do. We know the very first health effect of high radiation is a cardiac arrhythmia, and that's everywhere you read, everywhere you look. We see the cosmic rays. We see studies from those balloons increasing by incredible amounts, but sometimes those are based upon where we are in the solar system in terms of position. But we're still seeing an incredible increase. Now, professors are talking about increases in cosmic rays, sounding of the alarm, talking about dramatic increases coming from what? Instruments that are out even further, that are measuring cosmic rays out by the moon. Okay? And they're concluding the same thing the balloons are concluding. And those experiments have been all over the internet. We've featured them. Everybody's featured those balloon measurements. So whether you believe or don't believe that a photograph proves whether or not there's more visible light coming from the sun or not, whether you believe that or not, it doesn't matter. The instruments show ultraviolet C getting to the ground.